The content of this podcast has not been evaluated by Health Canada or the FDA. It is educational in nature and should not be taken as medical advice. Always consult a qualified medical professional to see if a diet, lifestyle change, or supplement is right for you. Any supplements mentioned are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Please note that the opinions of the guests or hosts are their own and may not reflect those of Advanced Orthomolecular Research Incorporated. Welcome to Supplementing Health, a podcast presented by Advanced Orthomolecular Research. We are all about applying evidence-based and effective dietary, lifestyle, and natural health product strategies for your optimal health. In each episode, we will feature very engaging clinicians and experts from the world of functional and naturopathic medicine to help achieve our mission to empower people to live their best lives naturally. Thanks for tuning in to Supplementing Health. Today I am happy to be welcoming back Dr. Kaycie Rosen Grigel, naturopathic doctor. Last time Dr. Grigel joined us, we discussed how hormones can influence anxiety and mood disorders. So if you'd like to check out that episode, it's episode 39, and I highly recommend you give it a listen. Today we'll be discussing the relationship between hormones and sleep patterns. So welcome back, Kaycie. Thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Okay, so melatonin is known as the sleep hormone. So would you share what melatonin's mechanism of action is that regulates sleep?
Absolutely. So melatonin is produced in our pineal gland, which is sort of right in the center of our brain. And it's produced in response to darkness. It's inhibited by light. And so it's one of our primary hormones that regulates the circadian rhythm of the sleep-wake cycle of the body. It sends a signal to our hypothalamus, which sometimes we call our master gland, and that then initiates the night state sort of physiological functions, things like lowered blood pressure, lowered metabolism, and also sleep.
So are there other hormones outside of melatonin that directly affect your sleep patterns?
Absolutely. So cortisol is the most obvious of these because it also has a circadian rhythm, but it sort of does the opposite. Cortisol is something that makes us feel more awake. But also, when I look at folks who are having insomnia, we look at progesterone, estrogen, I look at thyroid, and then I also look at neurotransmitters such as GABA or histamine or serotonin, glutamate, those kinds of things.
Okay, so melatonin influences the pituitary gland, which is a big part of thyroid hormones. How does that relationship actually play into your sleep and then overall hormone balance?
Sure. So melatonin is sort of has a balancing effect on the hormones that are governed by the pituitary. So generally with melatonin, when it is high, cortisol, thyroid, and our reproductive hormone secretion is much lower. And one interesting example of that is women in northern climates, for instance, will have greater fertility during the summer months when there's a lot more light, and therefore less melatonin production. But so generally they have to be there to balance each other out.
And so what's the relationship that vitamin D has with all of this then? Because technically vitamin D is also a hormone, but one that we can create from those rays of sun. So does it have some sort of role in this relationship as well?
That's an interesting question. Vitamin D certainly, as we all know, is something that is produced in the skin in response to sunshine, and it also impacts mood. It can impact our sleep because of its impact on mood. So I don't know if I would have to look up if there's a direct correlation between vitamin D and melatonin reactivity, but it certainly can play a role in how we think and feel during the different months of the year based on how much light there is.
Interesting. Now, you had previously mentioned that cortisol has its own circadian rhythm, and often that's kind of referred to as the cortisol curve, where it spikes early in the early hours of the day as part of your waking process, and then will drop off later in the evening to help you calm down and go to sleep. However, if you've got HPA axis dysfunction, obviously that curve can be completely out of whack. So can you explain the interplay of hormones that can cause this imbalance and how that how that can shift your sleep and what happens there?
Absolutely. So cortisol basically has one job. It mobilizes stored energy and it turns it into glucose to feed your body. And cortisol does this at two different times. The first is when we are under stress. It's one of our primary stress hormones. But historically, stress for humans meant escape from danger, run from a bear. So in order to do this, we have to think fast and we have to move fast. Adrenaline, or what we call epinephrine, is made during stress, and this helps our heart beat faster, it helps power our brain, and it helps power our muscles to make a quick escape. We make cortisol at the same time as adrenaline, and what it does is, again, it makes that glucose and it feeds the brain, it feeds the muscles, feeds the heart, and thus helps us to escape from danger. But the other time we make cortisol is when we haven't eaten in a while. So say 7 or 8 hours later after a meal, if we haven't eaten, then cortisol will be produced to mobilize sugar so you can keep thinking and you can keep going on with your day. So how that relates to sleep is if we have a ton of stress and we're making cortisol late at night, it keeps us up. But what I see even more is that for a lot of my patients, if blood sugar isn't stable, say you eat dinner at 6 p.m., by 3 a.m. it's been 9 hours since you ate last. And often what will happen, the blood sugar will get low and cortisol will spike, and then you feel wide awake.
Interesting. So that's part of why some people get that 3 a.m. waking spike when you've had a busy day or things like that.
That's right.
Awesome. Okay, so then how much does what you eat for your different meals or after a fasting period impact your overall cortisol production?
So diet and cortisol, there's kind of two different things that we're looking at. One is just keeping in mind that all of our steroid hormones, which include things like estrogen and progesterone and testosterone, as well as cortisol, they're all made from cholesterol. And so if there's a lot of cholesterol restriction in the diet, which vegetarian and vegan, or vegan diets in particular, don't have any cholesterol in them, or if we're just not giving our body the building blocks to make cholesterol, which just mostly has to do with eating an adequate amount of carbohydrate, or if we take statins that reduce our total cholesterol to a very low number, it can be challenging to make enough of these hormones. So that's one piece. But I think what you're getting at more has to do with blood sugar control. And so if we overproduce cortisol, that can actually cause some extra blood sugar fragility, because what happens is when we're stressed all the time, we're mobilizing sugar all the time, and then you end up having this sort of tendency towards what we call metabolic syndrome, or just that sort of blood sugar fragility anyway. But then also, if we eat a lot of refined carbohydrate, the blood sugar spikes and then it falls more dramatically. And then later we make more cortisol and it becomes sort of a cycle.
Okay, so then we know that obviously the things that our ancestors perceived as stress have very much shifted in modern day. Like we get kind of consistent triggers of stress, even if we don't consciously consider them stress. There's things stressing our bodies out, like the screens we're constantly sitting in front of and traffic and whatnot. So knowing that, and that that's now shifted how much cortisol our bodies produce, do things like short-term and long-term traumas, or big T and little t traumas, also play a role in what our body perceives as threats and that cortisol production patterns?
Absolutely. And because our life is so dramatically different than it was from our ancestors, just in terms of what stress means and how stress plays out physiologically, our stress response is somewhat inappropriate now, based on the type of stress we're having, because we do get this blood sugar spike more than we need, and then it plays this different role in what our metabolism does. So it causes us to gain weight, and then it also can cause that blood sugar fragility. So if we have short-term stressors, we may be making a lot of those stress hormones all the time, and that may disrupt sleep. And this can be manageable in the short term, and it's usually explainable in the short term. But if it becomes a long-term trauma that's even just a trauma that our mind keeps reliving, then if this stress is persisting for months or for years, it can really reprogram that whole circadian rhythm, and that can become really challenging to manage in the long term.
Now, speaking of the metabolic piece of it, um, like a 3 p.m. slump or cravings later in the day, especially if you've had a busy or stressful day at work, things like that, I'm guessing all ties into this whole hormone picture that we're talking about with cortisol spikes at inappropriate times and whatnot. So how, like, if you are experiencing those slumps, is that an indicator that you're going to have a rough night later in the day as well, or can that be managed so that you can kind of correct it on the fly?
Sure. I mean, diet is a really powerful tool for managing blood sugar. Obviously. And so if we know that we're going to have stress, then we generally need to be a little more careful with our diet. And there's basically a couple of ways that I have people think about that. One is think about the things that help your blood sugar to be more stable over time. And that is basically protein, fats, fiber. Protein and fats because it takes our liver longer to process them, so you get more of like a slow release into the bloodstream, as opposed to refined carbohydrates, which kind of go into the bloodstream right away. We spike and then it crashes. So that's one piece, is that protein, fats, and fiber. And then fiber basically just binds stuff in our digestive tract long enough that it gets absorbed into the bloodstream a little more slowly. So that's one piece, is that protein, fats, and fiber. And then there also has to do with timing. So timing, if we skip breakfast, for instance, it is really hard to make up for poor blood sugar later in the day. You have to start first thing in the morning by eating something that's going to balance your blood sugar throughout the day. And that's and then, something that has a little bit, again, that blood sugar stabilization piece at lunchtime is helpful. And that helps to moderate that mid-afternoon slump. And then conversely with sleep, if you're having that waking at 3 in the morning piece, then a little protein snack before bed can really go a long way, because you're just doing the same thing. You're helping that blood sugar to stay more stable for longer, and then you don't get that cortisol spike at 3 a.m.
Interesting. So with things like beans and like vegetarian or vegan proteins, you're getting the carbs and the protein in the same kind of grouping. So would something like that be like better than, say, a glass of milk or that has natural sugars in it, or does that matter?
That's an interesting question, and I think it's pretty personal, and it has to do with what your body tolerates. My mentor always said that a bowl of yellow pea soup before bed is the best thing for sleep. In 18 years of practice, have had very few patients take me up on wanting to eat yellow pea soup before bed. But so, to answer that question, perhaps it might be more effective. But also, I'll have folks eat things like an apple with some peanut butter, and then you are getting a little bit of carbohydrate, a little bit of fiber, and a bunch of protein. But you can do things that are simpler too. Something like a handful of nuts, or a spoonful of peanut butter, or a hard-boiled egg, or even like a little bit of Greek yogurt and some berries, whatever feels right.
Okay, cool. So then insomnia is often a symptom that actually accompanies menopause and becomes more common as we age. Is there a reason behind that? Is it due to the hormonal shifts, or is there something else at play there?
Well, you have a few things kind of butting up against each other when you're getting into that premenopausal time. And when we talk about that midlife hormonal shift, I like to talk to my patients about how hormones really work like a symphony. They have to all be balanced, and they have to all work together. The balance between estrogen and progesterone does shift as we head towards menopause. And this in itself can cause some insomnia, but also just symptoms such as hot flashes and night sweats can also cause some insomnia, because a lot of folks, a lot of women are going to wake up in the middle of the night and they're hot, or they're sweaty, and that's disruptive in itself. Also, it is important for us to recognize that as our ovaries stop producing estrogen and progesterone, the production of these hormones actually moves up to your adrenals. So if your adrenals are already taxed from a stressful life, that can exacerbate any pre-existing imbalance in adrenal hormone production. So something that was mildly problematic before with, cortisol can be more problematic. And then at the same time, with that symphony, sometimes we will also see concurrent shifts in thyroid hormone, and that can also disrupt your sleep.
So is it poor sleep that affects hormone functions, or is it, I guess, kind of like the chicken and the egg situation where it's almost like a cyclical pattern, right? If you're having sleep issues, that can also affect your hormone production, which then can affect your sleep issues again. So how do you start to break that cycle?
Yeah, so that's a great question because they do really feed each other. Once you start getting out of balance, it does tend to spiral. So, lack of sleep or shortened sleep has been shown to increase nighttime cortisol levels and blood sugar dysregulation. And then that makes that whole pattern a little bit worse. So, um, a lot of that in terms of correction, and we might talk about that a little bit later, is getting in those habits of sleep hygiene and really working at that sleep piece, and then using different things to sort of supplement and correct these imbalances.
Okay, so things like melatonin supplements or that sort of stuff?
Yeah, there are quite a few things that I use. And one of the things that I do like to talk to my patients about is we always talk about sort of three pillars of sleep, three things that have to be working in order for sleep to happen. One is we have to get our adrenals to go to sleep. One is we have to get our brain to go to sleep. And one is we have to get our body, our musculoskeletal system to sleep. And so we can use different types of natural substances to supplement that function in each of those arenas.
Okay. Now you had mentioned earlier symptoms like night sweats or hot flashes interfering with sleep, especially when you are in that perimenopausal or menopausal stage. But are there issues with hormone changes during menstruation and pregnancy that can create similar disturbances for sleep?
Absolutely. And anytime we're going to see a shift in the balance between estrogen and progesterone, we definitely will see some changes, especially as women get into their late 30s. It's very common to have a few tough nights of sleep before a cycle. And that, again, has to do with that shift between the progesterone estrogen balance. And then in pregnancy, there are so many reasons that you might be having trouble with sleep, ranging from achy backs and hips. You may get heartburn, you might get overheated. Other physical discomforts can disrupt sleep as much as any other hormone shift, which still could disrupt your sleep. Although, some women, just depending on what their hormones do outside of pregnancy, actually sleep better during this time.
Interesting. And so are postpartum sleep disorders a common thing that we see beyond just having a new baby that wakes you up frequently?
Yes, absolutely. So babies tend to not be great sleepers, at least for a little while. It's going to take any baby some amount of time to get on a schedule. And, there are certainly some profound hormonal shifts that take place during this time. But beyond that, when you are up every couple hours for somewhere between a couple months to a few years in a row, this can take a serious toll on the quality of your sleep. Often I'll see women who need to re-regulate their whole circadian rhythm after childbirth, and particularly after that first year to 2 years after the baby is born.
Oh, really? That's quite a while. So are there supplements that you recommend for balancing those hormones to help with sleep? I know you mentioned like there's different natural therapies that we can use to kind of calm the adrenals, the body, the mind. Um, but that's more for that sleep aspect. So then are there different supplements or are they the same supplements that you use for balancing those hormones?
Yeah, so depending on what is out of balance, if things like thyroid or reproductive hormones are out of balance, then, we can do some specific stuff for that. But in terms of that three pillars that I talked about, if sometimes if we address just one of those pillars, it will be plenty to get a person sleeping again. But sometimes we need to put a few things together. So, for adrenal, if there's that strong adrenal component, especially if you're waking in the middle of the night, I like blends that contain things like ashwagandha and phosphatidylserine, because what they do is they're tonics to the adrenals. They make the adrenals get stronger over time, but it's because they say, okay, now you can relax. You don't have to make those hormones right now. In terms of brain health, melatonin is certainly helpful for getting the brain to go to sleep because of that pineal piece. I also really like GABA because it's the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. And it helps the brain to shut off, just like we're helping the adrenals to shut off. And then in terms of muscle relaxation and pain control, that's going to really, just depend on what your particular situation is. But, using some minerals such as magnesium can really be helpful for getting the muscles to relax and get you to sleep.
Okay, cool. So for creating sleep hygiene or good sleep hygiene, what are your main tips for helping people fall asleep and stay asleep?
Absolutely. So, and I almost would prefer to talk about sleep hygiene first before supplementation, because it absolutely is the foundation and it always should come first. So number one, as we all know, is screen time. So light inhibits melatonin production, especially that blue light that you're getting from phones and computer screens. And so that can make it super hard to fall asleep. I know the nights that I tried to work a little bit later, I always pay for it when I'm trying to go to sleep. So, generally I have no screens in the bedroom, try to stop screen time an hour before bed. And then obviously doing relaxing things like a hot bath or a cup of herbal tea or some yoga or some stretching or some meditation, something for 15 to 20 minutes, even reading a book before before trying to sleep is invaluable for getting the body and mind ready. And then finally, again, if you're waking at 2 or 3 in the morning, a light protein snack, just like we talked about, just to keep that blood sugar stable so you can stay sleeping for the rest of the night. And keeping in mind that alcohol, particularly red wine and sugar, are very disruptive to sleep, and they also cause hot flashes. And so just keeping in mind what's going into your body in those last couple hours before bed really will impact how well you sleep through the night.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me. This has been lots of great information in here. Our listeners, if they want to work with you, they can get a hold of you through your website for your Colorado clinic. Is that correct?
That's right. It's goldenholisticmedicine.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much again for taking the time to chat with me today.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Supplementing Health. For more information about our guests, past shows, and future topics, please visit aor.ca/podcast or aor.us/podcast. Do you have a topic you want us to cover? We invite you to engage with us on social media to request a future topic or email us at marketing@aor.ca.